Vintage Thunderbirds is set in 2065, which allows for a lot of creative designs and concepts that are the very definition of awesome but impractical. A sight to behold, but could not exist in reality. Not likely anyway. And it's not just the Thunderbirds or any of International Rescue's gear. Last time we had the Fireflash, a supersonic jet that travels 6 times the speed of sound, and its atomic motors enable it to stay in flight for 6 months. This episode, Pit of Peril, not only introduces more of Thunderbird 2's pod vehicles, but it also features the Sidewinder, a giant US Army mecha designed for path clearing. It's strange because a Sidewinder is a type of rattlesnake, yet this thing looks like some giant robotic crustacean. If not for Path of Destruction, I'd call this the Crablogger. Anyway, the episode opens with live-action footage of the African jungle, including the wildlife, zebras, lions, elephants, crocodiles, etc. Of course, it's interspliced with the Sidewinder walking through the jungle, ripping trees from the ground with its claws, causing the animals to scatter. All the while, a US Army helicopter, or copter watchdog, follows. The copter crew consists of General Peters, Lieutenant Ralph, and an unnamed pilot. Once they're all out of the jungle, Peters congratulates the Sidewinder crew, Johnny, Frank and Colonel Sweeney, on a successful test run, and instructs them to head for Point 9, where the relief crew and helijet await them. The copter crew marvel at the Sidewinder and how it's just what the army needs for the bushfire wars that keep springing up. Yeah, despite what I said at the beginning of the video, this show loves to tempt fate. If some non-International Rescue vehicle, invention, device is praised even the slightest, expect it to backfire sooner or later. So as Copter Watchdog flies back to base, the Sidewinder heads for Point 9. Not 30 seconds later, the ground crumbles, and the giant mecha tumbles into the titular pit. We get a good look inside, and it's quite a blazing inferno down there. There appears to be military wreckage scattered across the pit, and the Sidewinder's landed on its side, except inside where the cabin and crew are somehow upright. I don't just mean the camera is positioned that way so the audience doesn't get dizzy. Throughout the episode, the crew are somehow able to move about as if the Sidewinder's actually the right way up. Back on Copter Watchdog, Peters tries to contact Sweeney and co, but they're out cold. Ralph spots some smoke in the distance, and the copter heads back immediately. Peters is eventually able to get through once the Sidewinder crew come to, and we learn that they've fallen 300 feet down. The aforementioned relief helijet radios in, and is ordered to the danger zone. Upon arrival, the copter and relief crews, the latter consisting of Sergeant Reynolds, Lieutenant Meade and the pilot Charlie, plan a course of action. Following in the footsteps of the premiere, the first half of the episode is basically them trying to rescue the Sidewinder, while Colonel Sweeney and co try to survive. The machine's air conditioning unit is keeping them cool, but as you'd expect, it won't last. Back up top, Reynolds and Meade suggest they go down and attach a cable so that the copter can pull the Sidewinder out. Which will be no easy feat, since the thing weighs 500 tons, to say nothing of the blazing temperatures down there. But what choice do they have, right? First, the helijet lowers Meade into the pit to attempt a reconnaissance. And like the premiere, Thunderbird 5 picks up the transmissions between Meade and the copter, and John radios Tracy Island immediately. This time, International Rescue wait until they're actually called for help, though Scott is put on emergency standby. We cut back to the site, and I remember as a kid being somewhat bored by the first half, as I found some of the sequences a little repetitive. You have Meade gradually lowered into the pit. He sees the Sidewinder and then is winched up. Not long after, Sergeant Reynolds is lowered with the cable, he attaches it to one of the Sidewinder's legs, and then he's winched up. You see where I'm coming from, right? I've since grown to appreciate scenes like this from a narrative/story perspective. It makes sense the events would play out like this. And when Meade and Reynolds are winched up, oh boy. Their outfits are smoking, their skin looks badly burnt, and their screams are audible. Needless to say, we can feel their pain. We even see Meade heavily bandaged at one point. Did I mention they went down there with only an oxygen mask and no other protective gear on? So as Meade and Reynolds are flown to hospital, the copter attempts to pull the Sidewinder out, and it actually looks like they're making progress. Unfortunately, the cable snaps because of course it does, and the Sidewinder tumbles back on its side. Not wanting to risk any more lives, Peters is almost at a complete loss, until he mentions the word rescue, which gets Ralph thinking. Sure enough, they contact International Rescue, and in no time, Scott and Virgil head out in Thunderbirds 1 and 2. The latter's accompanied by Brains. And they better hurry, as the hull of the Sidewinder has started to crack, with some smoke seeping through. At some point, the radio fails too. When Scott arrives, he discusses the situation with the General, and sends Thunderbird 1's remote control hover camera in the pit to investigate. Don't worry, it can take the heat. And Scott is able to watch the footage live inside his craft. Eventually, Thunderbird 2 arrives, and Scott, Virgil and Brains head down to the lab inside the pod. And Peters, highly concerned for his troops, grows increasingly impatient throughout the second half of the episode. In the lab, they're still watching the footage, and upon seeing some of the US Army wreckage, Brains explains that the pit was once a dumping ground for World War II military equipment, which, thanks to spontaneous combustion, became a hollow crater with a thin crust of topsoil which collapsed under the weight of the Sidewinder. You know it's lucky that that's the only pit they've happened upon in that area. Can you imagine if Thunderbird 2 had landed on top of another? Their plan is to remove what's left of the crust to make it easier to haul the machine up the side of the pit. And everyone has their cross faces on in this scene. I should point out that the puppets of the main characters have at least two expressions: happy bordering on neutral, and serious. So Virgil, in a protective suit and armed with explosive charges, is lowered into the pit via Copter Watchdog, though rather than have the copter hang on to him, they plan to retrieve him another way. Enter the most well-known of all the pod vehicles, excluding Thunderbird 4, the Mole, operated by Scott in this episode. Basically, it's a drill tank, and as Virgil lays out the charges, Scott heads underground to pick him up. Things are getting quite tense, as the conditions in the Sidewinder are now so bad that Frank is having trouble breathing. The Mole makes it through to the side of the crater, and once Virgil's work is done, they head back to the surface. When the Mole is clear of the pit, Brains detonates the charges, which appears to destroy the remainder of the topsoil. You'll find that whenever International Rescue's methods involve explosions or some sort of brutal force, the victims sometimes say, "What are they trying to do? Blow us up?" Then Virgil brings out the recovery vehicles. Like the elevator cars, one is manned, the other is remote controlled. Virgil aims and fires the magnetic lines, and those magnets must be pretty damn powerful, as they're able to drag the giant mecha up the pit, despite the lines looking relatively thin. Though the Sidewinder puts up a struggle, and one of the lines fails. Not to worry, Virgil simply fires again and they're back on track. Eventually they pull the Sidewinder out and the day is saved. Scott even checks up on the crew not long after, and though Frank is out cold, Colonel Sweeney thanks International Rescue for all they've done, as does General Peters. Like in the last episode, Scott requests that their organization remains anonymous, and Peters happily obliges, though secretly wishes they were part of his force. Pit of Peril was apparently one of 10 half-hour episodes/scripts extended to 50 minutes. It shows with how some scenes drag a little, like the Army's attempted reconnaissance and rescue. Nevertheless, it's still a pretty enjoyable episode. While not as energetic as the premiere, there are a few intense moments. The machines pretty much steal the show, again. Brains lives up to his name in his first prominent role, and International Rescue's sheer determination is as admirable as ever. So yeah, can't go wrong with this one. I plan to review the vintage episodes in original broadcast order, so next on the agenda is The Perils of Penelope. Unless, of course, I review one of a certain trio of episodes first.